Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all out here. It's been a while since I've been up here, but I do appreciate the opportunity that the elders have given me to speak tonight and to teach on a very important subject. But before we get started, I'd like to ask Forrest if you would lead us in a word of prayer. Thank you. So this series has been focused on the attributes of God. And as Ed said last week, this is the big one, right? This is what God says he is, one of the few things that he defines as himself. All these classes, I think, have been very inspiring and helpful for me for my faith in the walk with God. And so I hope that you find the same experience tonight as we go through this topic. So, what is love? How does the world define love? Elsa? Acceptance, yeah. I think that would definitely fit if you took a poll of most people not in this room. Anyone else have any thoughts? What do you think is going on? Ben? Yeah. Yeah. I think that one was a pretty commonly accepted definition. Anything else that comes to mind when you think of love, or if you've had conversations with people? Al? Yeah, a special relationship. Yeah, that makes sense. Affection. Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts, Steve? We'll get there. We will get there. What's that? Okay, I will come back to you then. I saw one other hand up. Jack. Yeah, it can be used as a negotiation tactic in some cases. Yeah, I've definitely observed or read about that in that way. Aaron? Yeah. Yeah. Those are all really good. Let's go ahead and do the classic dictionary definition here, because this comes, what the dictionary is not just a static document, right? It does get updated with how things are new words get introduced. So let's look at a few of these. So as a noun, right, strong affection for one another arising out of kinship or personal ties, something Al alluded to. Attraction based on sexual desire, affection, and tenderness felt by lovers. I think, Ben, that's something that you mentioned, so a lot of these themes that you guys mentioned are coming up here. But as a verb, right, it's not just a noun. So as a verb, to hold dear, it's a little vague, but I think we kind of understand what's going on there. And then to like or desire actively, to take pleasure in. So all in all, not bad, but I think, as Steve was probably thinking of, it's a little lacking, right? The Bible tells us a lot more about love than what a dictionary is gonna tell you here. So I think we've kind of already touched on this, but I'll just throw this question out there. In what ways might we misinterpret or overuse or misunderstand this word today? And this isn't just the world, right? Even ourselves. In what ways do we commonly maybe use this word a little bit out of its context or what it really actually means? Yeah. Inanimate objects, definitely. There was a hand over here. Okay. Yeah, that definitely gets used. I love ice cream. I love anything. I love that movie. Right. Yeah. Is there any other ways that gets used, Allison? Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think... Yeah. It's an interesting word, right? It's curious, right? Because even saying I love pizza, right? Well, we could just be saying, definition C there, he holds it dear, right? But it definitely misses a bit of what it's really intended for when you also can then say, right, I love my wife. It's a bit odd. Any other ways that you think that it gets misunderstood or misused?
I think one way that the definition has changed over time is, I don't know if you have to go back 50 years or 100 years or 150 years, but love for your fellow man used to be something that people thought was admirable. And none of these definitions even touch on that anymore.
Yeah, you're right. They really don't. They kind of skip over that. I mean, kinship is probably the closest, but it doesn't really focus on the point you were driving at. So, Ben? Right. Yeah, and that's kind of what earlier when I said it's almost used as a negotiation tactic, that's what people are effectively doing. I don't know if they realize it, but they're manipulating is the other way to say that. Luke? Yeah. Yeah. Lacking commitment, could you say? Yeah. I agree with all those thoughts. And when I wrote this title here, I'm sure some of you, when you first saw it, what is love? You might have thought of that song by Hathaway, and who's no longer an active artist, but nonetheless, I thought it was interesting. I read through that song because I thought, what we all know the chorus, but do we actually really know what he said? And one thing I thought that was interesting, after he says the word "whoa" 12 times in the first chorus, he says, "Oh, I don't know. What can I do? What else can I say? It's up to you." And I thought that was interesting because maybe that's sometimes how God feels with us. So now we get into a little bit more about what love actually should be. So let's look at how those definitions, don't forget any of those, how they line up with what the Bible says about love. But a bit of a word study here, because you can't avoid it if you're talking about love, right? Because we have one word, effectively, and Greek had more than one word when the Bible was written. So we do have to at least work through this a little bit. And I apologize in advance. I will probably not even pronounce some of them correct, but that's okay. I think we've all been there. So the first, one of the first instances of love that in Greek, ancient Greek, is a storge, which means an empathy, a bond, natural or family love. So I think we can all kind of understand the concept that's going on with this one. So a mother and a child you would describe that, especially right after the child was born. You would probably describe that love as a storge love. This is used well, I'll come back to that in just a second. The next one would be philia. And so this would be a little bit different in the sense that it's not necessarily natural. It's something that develops. So it could be between a friendship. It also, though, really implies that there's trust between the people that are experiencing this type of love. What's interesting is in Romans 12:10, the word actually philostorge is used. And that's actually to describe, he's using that to describe, well, I'll just read the verse so that I don't butcher it. Romans 12:10 says, "Be devoted to one another in brotherly love, give preference to one another in honor." So the word there, brotherly love, is that philostorge. So I think we get a little bit of context as to what both of those words actually mean. It's interesting they can actually be combined. Then, of course, there's eros, which is not actually, that term is not actually used in the Bible, but we know that it was a term that the Greeks would have understood to mean more of the sensual, right? Sexual, sensual. That's really what it was getting at. And then, of course, we come to agape, and it surprised me a bit. I haven't studied love as a subject in quite a while, and I thought there would be a little bit more, non-God. using God in the actual definition, but when you look at a lot of resources, that's literally what they're saying. It's God's love for humankind, which isn't surprising given that we're studying that God says He is love. He is agape. But there's a focus on a preference, and there's a focus on goodwill. And Luke, as you said earlier, the definitions that we just looked at that are in the dictionary that we have, that we're using today, they don't hit on any of that. They don't really talk about that. There's not necessarily inherent goodwill. There's no sacrificial component to it. But with agape, there absolutely is. Ed?
Whenever Arden Gingrich translated Bauer's lexicon, it was interesting. The very first word they had was esteem, E-S-T-E-E-M, which has to do with time, with value.
Yeah.
And so that I think it's very useful to think of agape as value. God values us so much. Yeah. When we value God and we value one another, that's kind of the emphasis of that. Philia is more has to do with affection, and therefore the loyalty that you talked about. Eros actually has to do with this desire for unity, a compelling yearning for unity, and it has to express itself sexually. So we is associated with that. But the reason that agape has God in all of the lexical work is once you got done with the first word of esteem, and then you had the dash, and then the rest of it. Arden Gingrich, translating Bauer also then made the point that agape was not found in Greek literature very much until you have the description of God in the New Testament. And so that's kind of an interesting thing, that it's almost a word that was coined. And so many writers, C.S. Lewis and others, made the point that this is divine love.
Yeah, I looked for that as well, a bit to understand, when did this word kind of come into use? And there is a reference, it is used in the Odyssey by Homer, which was 7th or 8th century BC. But in that context, it's different, right? She uses it when, forgetting his name because I'm up in front of a crowd, but anyway, when he comes home finally at the end in book 23, she uses that word. And it's more so implying like a welcome, or in that sense, or to esteem, right? That would actually make more sense as well using in that context. But yeah, it's not used a whole lot. in Greek literature prior to the Bible. Thank you. Those are definitely good points. What's also interesting I found is that this was actually translated, especially if you read the King James Version, it's actually translated charity. But then again, charity, when King James was written, did not mean the same thing that we think of it today, right? So it's not, oh, poor you, let me give you some money. It was more about the term, at least when it was written, would have been understood as impartial love. So that, I think, is important. If you're ever reading a King James Version and you come across charity, it's not that. It's not what we think of it today. So, the next question, though. So, knowing this, how do we define love as Christians? So, Steve, if you want to make your point. Yeah, 1 John 4:8. Yeah, which is actually the key text for tonight. So we will get there. So thank you for bringing that up, because that's two of my main points that we need to examine here. Thank you for bringing up that 1 Corinthians 13, because what a better list could we get? There's positive, right? What love is, and there's also what it's not, and that it helps us see it in multiple ways. And then I think it's kind of interesting. Just in case, right, at the end of chapter 13, just in case we didn't get it, right? Paul just says, in verse 13, but now faith, hope, love, abide these three, but the greatest of these is love. So just in case we weren't understanding that what his point was there, he's driving home, focus on love. Right? Faith and hope are important, but focus on love. Let's look at another couple of verses I want to look at here. Let's look at John 13, verses 34 through 35. And if anyone feels like reading these, I would appreciate that. John 13, 34 through 35. Any volunteers? Jack, thank you.
New commandment I give you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You are also to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.
Thank you. So this is an interesting passage here because it's a commandment, right? That's pretty clear. He says, a new commandment I give to you. So we need to pay attention to when the word commandment is being thrown out there. But then, verse 35, by this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have one love for another. So it's not only a commandment, right, but it's an identity. And that's how people will recognize us. So if we're not demonstrating love, if we're not doing all the things that 1 Corinthians 13 describes, then people aren't going to know who we are, who we claim to be as a Christian. And that's problematic. What's interesting, does anyone have any thoughts on that before I get to my next point?
It's not a new commandment when you think about it.
Yeah.
It's not talking about their neighbors themselves. Second, very law. But you call this a new commandment, and that should make us go, oh, how could this be new?
Right.
That passage is following what Jesus had just shown them. As I have loved you, well, what did he need to do? He just
Yeah, and it's interesting because in the context, right, Peter seems to kind of miss that whole point, right? Because verse 36, Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered, where I go you cannot follow me now, but you will follow me later. And then Peter says again, why can I not follow you? So Peter didn't, there seems to be no interaction to that statement, right? Good news is, though, right, Peter got it eventually, right? He figured it out, because as he writes in 1 Peter 4:8, he says, above all, keep fervent in your love for one another. So he eventually came back and remembered that commandment. Ed?
The other illustration is probably on one of your bullets, but Romans chapter 5, where he is talking about all these blessings that we have in Christ because of our faith. And he gets to this point in verse 6 where he says, while we were still helpless at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly, for one will hardly die for a righteous man, though perhaps for a good man some may dare to die. But God demonstrated his own love toward us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And when Jesus preaches in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, at the end of that chapter, that we've got to have that love even for our enemies, it really says something about the character. When he says in John 13, you've got to love the way I love. That's just an extraordinary qualification of it. And as Randy said, what's new about it is we see Jesus in the flesh actually doing that.
Yeah, that is new about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? I don't have Romans 5 as my next point, but that's an excellent verse to bring up in that context. One other, as we kind of putting this right into practice, another one I'd like to look at is Ephesians 5:25. So Ephesians 5:25 says, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. So that word there, of course, is agape. By the way, most all the verses that I'll reference from here on out, when the word love is used, it is the agape. So another command, right? And then pointing back to the example that we have, as you were mentioning, right? So it's not just a command that says, love your wives. Okay, I'm sure that the Israelites knew that was something they should do as well, right? But then there's that qualifier, right? To say, as Christ loves the church. Well, that's a whole other level that we have to attain to, right? Of course, we can turn to 1 Corinthians 13 and get a good list so that we make sure we do this correctly. But the key here, though, is that it's something that we do, right? We talked earlier about how the world will define love as a feeling, right? I fell in love, I fell out of love, I'm not in love anymore with this person. They're really describing a feeling. But this, based on the definition of the word agape and what we're being told to do here, it's not just a feeling. We're not just supposed to feel love towards our wives. There is action, right, that is supposed to be done. Okay?
It kind of messes up the whole world's definition of it because it's how you both marriage and Christ.
Yeah.
What really the thing about it is it's pretty selfless. You
Yeah.
can never be selfish. This whole definition we're talking about, real love is the sacrificial love and the selfless love. We as humans just aren't good at that. And so it's you feel the way we are, Christ is the same way. This is not the kind of love that is Christians love. Really, in this world, the world is you're never going to think about yourself. You're always going to put everybody else in front of you. No matter what. It's so hard.
It is. Let's look at now that key text and understand a little bit more how God is love. God is this thing that we are told to do. So let's turn over to 1 John chapter 4, verse 7 through 8. So verses 7 and 8. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. And then he goes on again, and by the way, repeats that phrase, God is love, in verse 16 as well. But let's focus on verses 7 through 8 here. One key is that every word where the word love is used in these two verses is agape toi. So it's in the verb form, as far as I understood. And then what's back to a point I made earlier about love being an identity as Christians, which is something that Jesus mentioned as he was giving that new commandment. The 6 verses prior to this section are talking about our identity as Christians. Right? It's telling us what we are if we are from God. That phrase "from God" is used. I think it's. I don't have the exact count here, but I believe it's used 7 times in these first 6 verses. So that's kind of interesting, right? He's setting us up to say, if you are of God, if you are from God, then you will demonstrate love. And then we get to this interesting, the way that this is phrased, right? We get to this interesting point about God is love. Does anyone have any thoughts on how to break that down, how to a little bit put that into words that we can understand a little better? Jerry?
It's a fascinating statement in my mind. Algebra is equivalent to an equal sign.
Mm-hmm.
We struggle through trying to figure out if the word problem, oh no, and how do I come up with a mathematical statement? Well, it was a big help. My tutor said, when you see is, that is the equal sign. So to think of God and love are equal, that causes me to use a part of my brain that wouldn't normally be used to talk this back.
Yeah.
That I think it's a summary statement to verses 22 and 23 of the preceding chapter, chapter 3, 22 and 23. He said, God said that, and this is the commandment, that we believe in his Son Jesus, the Christ, and that we love one another as he has commanded us. There's 2 commandments in one sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And that God is love. That's a lot to be able to try to accomplish.
Yeah.
And when I start to think that, okay, today I accomplished that I don't accomplish that.
Yeah.
I think Romans 5:6 is the answer that get brought out. That while we were still weak, that Christ died for us. I'll stop here. This is love. You're doing a great job.
Oh, no, thanks. Yeah, that is interesting, right? Because you could just point back, like you said, you think through your day, well, did I demonstrate love today, right? Go to 1 Corinthians, and you really read that list, right? Of 16 things. You're probably going to have missed at least a few of them in any particular day. Yeah, it's challenging. Ed, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to notice that what happens with the equivalents is usually you can flip them around. And so people will say, well, love is God. And so why do I need to go to church for? If as long as I love, I've got God.
Yeah.
But this is used grammatically as a modifier of God rather than as an equivalence. And so we would say like a predicate adjective or a predicate nominative. God is love is the biggest, the most effective characteristic, the key to God. And while that has a truth about it that's important to remember, it's kind of more powerful sometimes to actually look at it as though they were an equal sign, because it's true that love is not God, but so much of God's character is fundamentally love that anytime we try to qualify it and move away from that, we're really making excuses and trying not myself instead of benefiting myself and the other person by benefiting God.
Yeah, that's something I think that's I think where we get tripped up, right? We think, well, love is something that benefits me, right? God loves me, he shows his love to me, look at all the things he's done for me. And then it almost, just thinking of it, right, almost puts you in a selfish mind frame until you remember, wait a second, I have to reciprocate that back out immediately. Otherwise, I'm not doing what he asked, right? Because let's keep in mind that it's not just that God is love, right? The first part of verse 8, the one who does not love does not know God. So, and I thought that was an interesting phrase, right? Does not know God. Well, of course we know God, right? We're reading about him. We read our Bibles. We can read 1 Corinthians 13. We can read a lot of things about God. So what does that mean that we do not know God if we're not demonstrating love? Well, I looked into that, the way that that's phrased a little bit more, and many of you probably have as well. But the same phrase, and this is, I'm going to butcher this, but it's auk, igno, is used in John 17:25 and Romans 10:19. And so those two verses give you a little bit more context of what this phrasing here that John is using actually means. But the whole point here, the better way to describe this is that you have never attained the knowledge of. So it's not that you knew God and then you kind of forget, you lose your way a little bit. He's saying you never knew him at all if you're not demonstrating love. Because how could you even claim to know him if you're not demonstrating love? It's like if I said, I know Brad Pitt, right? Because I've read articles about him or I've seen things on the news. Well, I don't actually know him. I never have known him, really, because I've never even talked to him, right? He and I don't have a relationship. There's nothing there. And so that's what he's actually saying, which is a little bit, it's kind of concerning when you read it that way. But that was John's intent, the way that this verse is phrased. And it doesn't pop out immediately, but when you really start examining it, that's what he's trying to tell us. And so it's a reminder for us. But then, given that this is God's identity, we can actually still find comfort in that, right? Because, take yourself back, what is love? Love is God's preference, right? His overwhelming desire to save us, to have a relationship with us, right? So if we're demonstrating that, then God is reciprocating that to us, and so he being the creator of the world, right? The creator of us, well, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good standing to be in, right? To have the creator of yourself, right, of the entire world, showing that same love that we're supposed to be aiming toward, right, daily, showing that back towards you. Luke. Yeah. Ben, good point. Okay.
Right along with the same point is agape was the first one. All the other ones came through.
Yeah.
And if you look like it's John chapter 17, verse 24, Father, I desire that they also whom you have given me may be with me where I am, and see my glory which you have given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. I mean, when you think God is love, we keep thinking of it from just our perspective, but all that love is eternal. Between the relationship with Jesus and God, and we're holding it around, and it's going to go on forever. So when you think of God as love, it's that same way. God has
Yeah. So on that note, right? So if we had to ask ourselves, what demonstrates that God is love to you? What's the first thing that comes to mind? Okay. So let's focus on that just for a second. So how does that happen? Right? What demonstrates? How do we even have that, Aaron? Yeah. Yeah, so it required a sacrifice, right? As you pointed out, verse 10 of 1 John chapter 4, right? To be the propitiation for our sins. So something had to be done. He knew that. Something had to be done. And so what did he do? He sent his son. And the verse I have here, not 1 John, but John 3:16. I think we all know that one by heart. When he says, "For God so loved the world," right? Another way of course he loved the world, right? Okay. But if you look at that with the understanding that we're developing here tonight, another way to read that would be, so God so preferred the world, right? He so desired, not the world as it gets defined in terms of sin and corruption and all that, but us, right? What he created, which is us. We are his greatest creation. He desired that so much that he had to provide a way for us to come back to him, once sin entered the world.
I wanted to pick up on that propitiation because he valued every soul so much that he recognized that sin was the problem. And so therefore, Jesus was able to come and be the sacrifice of atonement that could reconcile us to God, could take us away from this condition of all these failures that we have chosen and put us in the right relationship with God. And the implication of that in the verses that we just read is that somehow has to become my attitude. Mm-hmm. That I value everybody enough, that like Jesus did, or like God did, that I'm willing to sacrifice others, that I'm willing to sacrifice for their spiritual, because they are spiritually valuable. Now that doesn't mean I don't care about their physical or their psychological, but I care about them secondarily.
Yeah, because Jesus, right, in what he did, he demonstrates this love for us, right, in a way that no one else ever has, and no one else ever will. If you truly understand what he did, what he went through, the plan of God, which many of us do, right, no one ever throughout history has ever measured up, and no one ever will, to what he did for us. And back to a point that was made towards the beginning, right? How these worldly definitions of love, they really are selfish, right? But everything that Jesus did, as he demonstrated the love of God for us, right, in his sacrifice, is the complete opposite of that, right? It's unselfish in every way. There's not a selfish element that you could put on what he did. I mean, one thing, right, that just kind of reminds us, in case we, as we're reading, right, the account in the latter part of the Gospel, specifically in Luke, in chapter 23, right, even after he's on the cross and he's enduring unbearable pain and treatment and whatnot, he still says, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do, right? Then, not just a few minutes later, right, he's actually listening to, not just caught up in what he's going through, which none of us can really even imagine that. He's actually listening to what the two people on the right and the left of him are saying, and he actually takes time to weigh in, right, to try to save just one more person, right? At no point in his life did he ever stop agape, right? So I just think it's tremendous that we have that example, and yet we still fail so frequently. Jeff?
We've been going through the quarter, and we've talked about, God is almighty, God is righteous, God is holy, all those things. But if you think about what's the plot for the Bible, it's not that God is almighty, it's not that God is righteous, or even God is holy, it's that God is love.
Yeah.
And that's what the whole book is about. So that kind of tells you what, more than any other single characteristic, what has driven his relationship with man and love.
Yeah. Yeah, the only other God is statement that I'm aware of, and maybe there could be a third, but I'm not aware. The only other one is God is light, right? And so he's saying God is light. He's declaring that he is light to the world, and he is love to the world. And everything else is what we can say is an attribute, right? But this is his identity. And so if you're looking for central themes and where you should be focused, this would definitely be it. So in these last, looks like 2 minutes, I think we've already described and we understand that he loves in a way that's unique to him. But I'm not sure if we've answered this exactly, so I'll throw this question out here is, why does God love us? Right? Why does he love us? Why should we also demonstrate this toward others? Why does he love us? It may sound like an odd question.
I think it's inadequate that he gave us a sense of that we became parents.
Yeah.
He is our Father, and as fathers and mothers, we love our kids. We can't describe that to anyone who's not been a parent in adequate terms. And that's part of the inadequacy of it. To relegate our love for our children to God love us is probably unfair. So we have a sense of
Yeah.
that in our own physical relationship.
Yeah. Well, everything often falls short, right, when you compare things to God, but that is a good sense to. Did I see a hand back here? Yep, back in the back. Yeah. Yeah, and that's what he's trying to get us to adopt, right? He wants that to be part of our nature, part of how you operate every day. It's not just a feeling, right? It's not just something that you do for a period of time, right? It's something that just, it never ends. Yeah, that's a good point. Grant.
It's important to remember from these passages on about, God having, essentially giving Christ before we were ever created. But he didn't create us and then love us. He created something that he wanted to love. He decided what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
So he loved us before we even, formed us out of dust.
Yeah.
He knew that we wanted to. And so it's not that he chooses to love us like he created when we were
Yeah.
prepared at a plan of what he was going to do for his people. It's very similar to his description of Israel when he's, essentially rebuking them and saying, "But I pulled you out of Egypt because you were so wonderful and mighty,
Right.
whatever." No, he was a new and day out in the field, like told you to help us.
Yeah, so on that point, I'm out of time here, but on that point, I just want to leave you with this last thought. So knowing all of this, if you think about, how can we help the world better understand love? There's clearly a misconception. A lot of people are living, or I should say, demonstrating love in a way that's not accurate, it's not correct, it's not godly. And so a big part of this, though, as has been mentioned earlier, is our actions, right? Demonstrating that love. And then the last thing I'll say here is the saying that you've probably heard before is that people won't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so I think if you keep that in mind and try to demonstrate that when you're interacting with others, might help us live out this agape a little bit better. Thank you for your time.